Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to our webinar co-organized by the Eurogulf Information Center and the European Institute for European Policy, where we will be looking at a very timely topic, which is populism and nationalism in the time of coronavirus. I am pleased that today we are joined by such distinguished speakers. Let me introduce them. Anna Luhrmann, Deputy Director of the Varieties of Democracy Institute. Christian Kvorning-Lassen, Deputy Director of European Institute for European Policy, our today's partner. Valina Sakharova, Head of the Austrian Institute for European and Security Policy, EGIC's very dear partner. And last but not least, Nicola Burazer, Executive Editor of the European Western Balkans. Welcome to all of you and thank you for joining us today. I am Nicola Zukalova and I am an analyst and regional outreach for Central and Eastern Europe at the EGIC. And I will be today's moderator and I am looking forward to a fruitful discussion. The webinar is part of EGIC's Coping with Coronavirus webinar series that examines the impact of COVID-19 on different fields from various perspectives. And we are very happy to have partnered with European for this session, already our second joint event. So I would like to extend our thanks to the European team and especially Gigafactor for helping in putting this event together. Today, as we said, the focus will be on nationalism and populism, which if you follow the political developments in Europe, but also beyond, has been at the center of debates as a resurgent trend in relation to several countries' turn inwards in dealing with the coronavirus pandemic and introduction of restrictive policies. We have seen some populist governments and politicians dismissing scientific evidence and downplaying the crisis, but also exploiting the pandemic and the emergency measures for domestic political gains and power consolidation, criminalizing dissent and scapegoating the others, as well as shifting away from international cooperation. So it is important to follow those developments, not only for us or those coming from or focusing on the specific countries and regions that we will be talking about today, but also to draw some lessons learned maybe and try to resist such tendencies. But also for many around the world, including, for example, the Gulf, which is EGIC's focus, who will now wonder what is happening in Europe and what's coming next, as many European policies and priorities can be expected to be influenced by the spike in nationalism, anti-establishment and anti-EU rhetoric coming from some European capitals, which might affect the EU's internal dynamics, as well as its external engagement. And it is therefore important for us to discuss the political consequences of COVID-19 pandemic in relation to nationalism and populism, and perhaps also the potential long-term ramifications, which is exactly what we will be doing today. So before we begin, I would just like to lay out how we will proceed today. The speakers will each open with about a 5 to 8 minute introduction. Then I will ask them a few questions using my moderator's privilege before we move on to the Q&A with the audience. So please, if you have any questions for the speakers related to today's topic, write it in the Q&A section down below. And we will get to the questions in the second part of this event. Also, I would like to point out that there is an option to vote out other people's questions if you are interested in hearing them. So we will regard that order as well, as probably we won't be able to go through all the questions. So I think that now I talked more than enough, and I will leave the floor to our speakers. So I would like first, Anna, please, the floor is yours.
Yeah, good morning, and thanks for having me on this panel. Indeed, a very important and timely topic. I would like to focus on one of the points that you raised, namely, you said that it differs if populists are actually in government or not in government, and that affects sort of the way that they respond to COVID-19, to the corona crisis, and what they do. We at the Varieties of Democracy Institute at the University of Gothenburg, we have focused during the last weeks a lot on assessing what the government responses to COVID-19 are, and trying to find out if they are a threat to democracy actually, or not. Because it is quite clear that, of course, this is an enormous crisis, and that governments need to respond to them swiftly. But we know from the history, and we also have rules and regulations in international law that clearly say that in order to maintain democracy during a time of crisis, such responses need to be proportionate, necessary, and non-discriminatory. Right? So proportionate to the crisis, necessary in order to address the crisis, and it's not allowed to discriminate against other people. And this is particularly a point with which populists and nationalists, of course, have a problem. We have reports, for example, from Bulgaria that Roma are addressed differently from the government in this crisis, and this is something that clearly violates democratic standards. So if we say that government responses have to be proportionate, necessary, and non-discriminatory, then what does that mean concretely during this crisis? So what we've done at the Vidam Institute, probably a lot of you know, we are the world's largest, we host the world's largest database on democracy. We work in general with more than 3,000 country experts to assess all parts of democracy. And now during the last weeks, we've reached out to 30 people from our network to assess now the current government responses, and came up with a pandemic backsliding risk index. And this pandemic backsliding risk index that I'm going to show you in a minute basically says that quite a lot of countries are at a high risk of backsliding, so of losing democratic standards during this pandemic. Here I'm showing you a map that I hope you can see now. And this map shows you basically the countries that are at the risk of pandemic backsliding. You can see on that map which countries that are in particularly. In total, there are 48 countries that are at a very high risk of democratic backsliding during the crisis now. 34 countries are at a medium risk. The good news is that 47 countries are not at the risk of pandemic backsliding. So they show that it's really possible to respond to this crisis without actually jeopardizing democratic standards. And in order to measure this, we basically say that we have 9 standards that fulfill this criterion, that government responses are proportionate, necessary, and non-discriminatory. And these 9 standards are, first of all, that the executive power should not be expanded without a sunset clause and without oversight. So that's really important, that those measures are really just time limited to the crisis. Second, they should not be discriminatory. Thirdly, they should not derogate from the rights that the International Covenant for Civil and Political Rights, the ICCPR, has declared as non-derogable rights. So these are, for example, freedom from torture and these kind of things. Fourth, they should not pose restrictions on media freedom, because we say that, yes, it might be proportionate to the crisis to restrict the freedom of movement in order to stop the spread of the virus, but it's really not proportionate to restrict media freedom. And unfortunately, a lot of countries, including some EU countries, have put limitations on how the media can report about COVID-19. And we say that this is really something that helps populists and nationalists to actually undermine democracy and abuse this crisis in order to do so. Finally, number 5 is then also draconic punishments for violating these restrictions. 6, that there should not be limitations on electoral freedom and fairness. And here, for example, the Polish government is clearly on the line with their attempt to hold the election in May. First, they wanted to introduce absentee voting only for elderly citizens, which would have clearly favored their constituents. And now the election is still scheduled, and a lot of people are afraid that the ruling party will have an advantage over the opposition now during the election campaign due to all these restrictions on campaigning and mobility. 7th, democratic responses to COVID should not put disproportionate limitations on the role of the legislature. So it's really important that there's some oversight and some participation of this body that represents citizens even during this crisis. And many examples from across the world show that parliaments can be effective even during times like these. 8, there should also not be disproportionate limitations of judicial oversight. This is probably something that we can only assess and fully later. And finally, and this is something that has been really big in the news already, unfortunately, of course, all the COVID-19 related measures should not be enforced in an arbitrary and abusive way. And here we've really seen reports from around the world, from India, from Kenya, from Bulgaria also, that really shows that the police in some cases has been abusing their power now to enforce this. So this is basically how we constructed this index. So we say, yes, we see quite some countries to be at a very high risk of actually democratic declines during COVID-19. And we also assess that they are at a higher risk if already in those countries autocratization, so the decline of democratic standards has been ongoing over the last years, because we say that those kind of rulers are the ones that are most likely now to welcome this kind of opportunity to continue with their erosion of democratic standards, which is often related to populism and nationalism. Yeah, so this is our index. Maybe I stop here for now, and we can address more points during the Q&A.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Anna. Now I would like to ask Christian if you would like to take over, please.
Okay, I just had to unmute myself. Yes, thank you very much, Nicola, and thank you very much, Anna, and for the very interesting insight, and thank you so much for inviting me here on this morning. As you mentioned, it's a very topical issue, and within an EU context, perhaps especially from the V4 countries who for a prolonged period of time have been skidding around the edges of what is generally considered acceptable in relation to European values and the Copenhagen criteria. And as a result, a lot of Euroscepticism has festered here over the years, and COVID-19 has only exacerbated these tendencies, in large part because of the Eurosceptic elites that have been very keen to capitalize on this development. We see right now, as was already alluded to in Hungary and Poland, that the democratic backsliding that has gone on for upwards of a decade now are being accelerated further under this crisis. And even though the Czech Republic and Slovakia is not anywhere close to that by any means yet, we do see tendencies that Anna also outlined, that media freedom is, while not restricted, but more controlled than it was before, raising questions on how the crisis will impact the region from a more long-term perspective, especially also given that Czech Prime Minister Andrej Babiš owns several of the mainstream media houses within the country. But if we take a bit more overall perspective, and if we make some more general considerations about COVID-19's impact and the schism between populists and nationalists and those favoring multilateralism, I think we can more or less narrow it down to 4 points that we have to both consider and be aware of. And first of all, as Anna already mentioned, democratic backsliding is one of the core considerations of long-term ramifications that we need to make. But this COVID-19 crisis really is at the heart of the intersection between multilateralism and nationalism, and that also impacts climate change, it impacts the economy, and it impacts our general security situation, because COVID-19 has, if anything, pushed the US even further away from being the global leader and security guarantor that Europe has traditionally relied on, leaving a vacuum that either China might try to fill, or Russia, or, if in a best case scenario, the EU will start stepping up and actually become a more viable geopolitical entity. But as Anna also mentioned, this rise of populism usually carries several characteristics that have, in many ways, in the worst case, exacerbated the crisis, in the best case, not really addressed it properly. We see populists across the board denying scientific evidence, which again is at the intersection of climate change as well. We see an unwarranted optimism because populists are fundamentally incapable of actually addressing challenges. Their whole foundational premise usually lies on the fact that they claim ownership of beneficial things happening to society, while doubling down on divisions whenever things go wrong. And even though the attempts have been made to attribute COVID-19 to foreigners, such as was the case in Hungary, where some Iranian students were wrongly accused of being responsible for the introduction of COVID-19 into the country, it later turned out that it was a Hungarian, and the strategy hasn't really worked that well, because it is very hard to just attribute a virus such as COVID-19 to the foreigners while feeding the illusion that your own population is unaffected or pure, in a sense. So in many ways, I think COVID-19 exacerbates the fallacies we already knew were relevant to populism, that basically it's incapable of addressing the global challenges, both contemporarily, but also the ones waiting tomorrow, such as climate change. It's incapable of fostering an egalitarian and just society, simply because it is contingent on having others to attribute negative things to, rather than actually tackling them. And we're seeing that, especially in the US, in Brazil, but also in some European countries, having widespread ramifications on their own populations. Whether or not that in the end will materialize into a more widespread revelation that nationalism and populism are incapable of tackling the challenges not only of COVID-19 but also climate change and geopolitical security, that remains to be seen, and I'm hesitant to be completely optimistic, especially after Brexit and Trump's election. But I think if anything, COVID-19 shows that the case for multilateralism and the narrative surrounding it are far more compelling than the alternative, the nationalistic populism that has swept over the world within a bit more than the past decade since the financial crisis. So yeah, I think I will end here for now, and hopefully there will be some relevant questions from the audience. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Christian. Now I would like to give the floor to Valina Sakharova. Valina, please.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for having me today. This is a very, very relevant topic, and as we can see, there are various perspectives on it. My institute, the Austrian Institute for European and Security Policy, is looking at the trend of populism and nationalism from the perspective of global and regional trends, as well as scenario monitoring. The main question here is for us at the Institute is what will be the repercussions for the regional stability in Europe, of course for the individual countries, but also for the regional stability altogether on the old continent, and of course what will be the repercussions for the political cohesion of our European Union institutions. So we are very much looking at these trends, and one of the perspectives that I would like to give you is that we see the rise of populism and nationalism in the context of a global de-globalisation cycle. This one began immediately after the great financial crisis in 2007 to 2009. It was linked, of course, to major socioeconomic systemic processes, and some of them, they are familiar. I mean, all of the member states in Europe are familiar with them. Major austerity programs were introduced. There was the case of indebtedness, so growing indebtedness, not only on the side of the countries, but also on the side of the citizens. That led also, of course, to a growing gap between rich and poor. Shrinking middle class is a trend here in Europe, contrary to other parts of the world where we observed a rising middle class. Of course, major parts of the population coming out of the low income groups, which is of course good news. But here, of course, in Europe, in the developed economies, basically the middle class was really hard hit. And as we know from the last century, the middle class, this was the main pillar, the stabilizer of our political systems, trying to basically bridge these two traditional parties that we know. On the one side, the Social Democrats, and on the other side, the conservatives, the Christian Democrats. And basically this vacuum, of course, was filled not only by populists, I would say, by major movements. Let me remind you that En Marche by Macron was a major movement, actually, that was also rising as a new way of articulating political demands. Then on our side, I mean, in the case of Austria, we also had a very, very young leader of the conservative Christian Democrats Party, the People's Party, who basically launched a kind of a movement here. This was the way how he actually won the elections in 2017 with slogans such as system change. So this is the one side of the story. We observe these trends as cyclical trends, historically seen. If you look at the 100 years cycles, these are processes that will keep rising. And of course, the main question for our political decision makers, for the organizations, for the think tanks, for all these institutions that support democratic processes here in Europe, is how to strengthen good governance, how to strengthen our values, how to strengthen our norms and rules, so that we have a solid ground which can basically build also on the 21st century more or less fundamental new kind of movements, if you like, political, be it political, social, and so on and so forth, as opposed to agendas that populists are pushing for. Now, let me say some words about the Austrian case. For Austria, the phenomenon of populism and nationalism is not a recent phenomenon, yet it manages to thrive on this cyclical crisis in Europe again and again. Last one was the case with the migration crisis in 2015. It is, of course, also centered around anti-European Union policies. It is anti-establishment, anti-migration, anti-Islam, also pro-nationalism, or if you like, Austria first, so sort of slogan. So the Austrian Freedom Party, this is our far-right party here in Austria, is remarkable not only for its enduring success as a right-wing populist party since the 80s, but it's also remarkable for its participation in government at the federal and the state level. So we have a federal system, so they have been already participating in state level and also were part of coalitions at national level. And it was, in fact, the only far-right party in power in Western Europe when it joined the coalition as a junior partner with the conservative Chancellor Sebastian Kurz in 2017. So, like I said, the main catalyst was the migration crisis in 2015. This was actually why the Freedom Party capitalized politically and entered also the government coalition. During its time in power, the Freedom Party became caught in a sort of series of race wars, and eventually, just 1.5 years later, the party leader, together with one of his closest inner circle members, were caught up in a scandal video. This was like I said, in May 2019, so just 1.5 years later, and it eventually resulted in his resignation as a party leader. It resulted also in a big political crisis, which also resulted or led to snap elections. And these snap elections, very interestingly, were, we saw actually that this very same Freedom Party lost 10% of their electoral vote. So this was basically a clear sign, a clear vote, if you like, against the party. So they lost about 1/3 of the party's seats in the parliament, and they are right now, so currently sitting in the opposition. So few more sentences about the current situation with the pandemic, and I will leave it up for the other colleagues to have more space for their inputs, and I can also ask questions afterwards. Right now, what happened after the coronavirus virus outbreak basically came to Europe is that the Austrian government, which is right now composed of the conservatives, this is the People's Party of the Chancellor Kurz, and the Greens, reacted very timely, very swiftly, and very transparently. That means that already at the beginning of March this year, we had a complete lockdown. The government coordinated between all members of both parties in the coalition, but also with the opposition. Everyone was involved. It is a big crisis management center, having all the different experts and also members of leading institutions here in Austria, which is why the response by the government was very well received by the population. Now, if you look at the polls, the Chancellor Kurz has actually, I think it's in third place right now after Germany and Denmark regarding the government's crisis management and the crisis response. And of course, the Freedom Party used the situation to criticize the crisis management, the transparency of measures. So basically all this process that was introduced since March 9 was more or less used, of course, to capitalize on certain issues. Right now, we are in a situation where we already started reopening the economy, and once again, there is a criticism on the side of the Freedom Party. But like I said, on the matter of the pandemic response, there is no space for our populist party to score bonus points, because the policies and the measures by our government, and like I said, it's a government built by two very different parties that have worked very closely together. Our Vice Chancellor is a member of the Green Party, so they were on the same page from day one, and this consolidated policy brought actually very good results also, because they closed the gap and they didn't give any space for this sort of populist slogans or populist responses, if you like. And like I said, over 70% of population actually, according to current polls, supports the government's response, which I think is a clear signal that right now we are in a very, very good, not only in a very good track regarding the health crisis, but also regarding the response to populist movements. Thank you very much for the patience. I think I could wrap it up as shortly as possible.
Thank you very much, Valina, for your contribution. And I will now turn the floor to Nicola.
Okay, so thank you, Nicola. Well, I'll try to give a brief explanation of what the situation is at Europe's periphery, or we could say EU's backyard, which is the Western Balkans, with, of course, focus on Serbia, which is not only the country where I come from, but also the country which has the most interesting example out of all the countries in the region when it comes to populism and response to the pandemic. So I would say that we in the Western Balkans invented populism, nationalist populism, a long time ago, back in the 90s, before it was cool. So you would expect that today's circumstances are gonna, let's say, bring some new wave of populism, especially given the fact that democracy has been deteriorating in the region for the past several years. But interestingly, in the region, we could not see any nationalist outbursts. There was no blaming of the other ethnic group for the faults for either spreading of the virus or the lack of efforts to combat it. Even in Bosnia and Herzegovina, which is a multi-ethnic country where usually you could expect ethnic conflicts, I mean, like conflict between the political parties to occur on almost daily basis, this was almost absent in the current crisis. So we could say that's a positive thing. But the pandemic resulted in a series of internal political crises, and especially in Kosovo, where even the government fell because of the dispute of how to respond to the COVID-19 pandemic. Of course, the reasons go much deeper than just the response, but still you get the impression that this particular crisis can be used for some other political concerns as well. Now, in the Western Balkans, we expected to have parliamentary elections in 3 countries. In Serbia and North Macedonia, elections were actually expected in April. And in Serbia, we are actually in the middle of an electoral campaign when the state of emergency was declared and all pre-election activities were suspended. Now, about Serbia, it's a pretty interesting example when we speak about populism, because you could see an increasingly authoritarian pattern in the country for the last several years, which comes in the form of basically disregard for all institutions, accumulation of power in the executive, or even not even the executive, but the president, who doesn't have any constitutional competences outside formal ones, and almost complete control of both electronic and print media. And all of these phenomena were already well documented in important indexes and scales. For example, the Reporters Without Borders media freedom list, where Serbia dropped more than 30 places in the last couple of years. Then Serbia fell from free to the partially free category according to Freedom House, especially because of the concerns with media freedom. And the European Commission itself basically stated in its Western Balkans strategy from 2018 that there are elements of state capture in all Western Balkan countries. So this is more or less the baseline. And what is especially important when it comes to Serbia is that before the pandemic, we had both, let's say, this electoral campaign and upcoming elections, but we also had a major political crisis where actually the opposition has been boycotting the parliament for a couple of years now, and it announced the boycott of the parliament as well. And there were some attempts to somehow, through this dialogue, which was mediated by the European Parliament representatives, to somehow find a common ground so the opposition would take part in the elections, but this was unsuccessful. So Serbia was not only in the middle of a crisis, it promised to be a much bigger crisis down the road after the elections take place and after basically there is no opposition in the parliament at all. And the elections were supposed to take place on 26th of April, so only 3 days ago. But after the pandemic erupted, of course, it all came to a halt. Now, when it comes to the response to the pandemic itself, well, the government tried to somehow, let's say, make this as a non-issue. Like the virus is the most ridiculous virus in the history of mankind. I'm quoting one of the doctors who was a member of the crisis headquarters who stood next to the president on a press conference in late February. They literally said that this is the funniest or the most ridiculous virus in the history of mankind, which exists only on Facebook, and not even tests are necessary. Basically nobody should be worried. Our lifestyle will not change at all. And after this statement, we had basically the elections being announced, and we had the ruling party collecting signatures in mass rallies. And only after the first cases were reported at the beginning of March, it all shifted literally overnight, where from the most ridiculous virus in the history of mankind, we got to a grave danger to the existence of the Serbian nation. And this basically happened almost overnight. What was the response? Well, after the shift occurred, so after the government showed, they really understand the virus is a big concern, they basically started putting the experts in the front rows. So unlike some other countries where the government official virus, in Serbia, they actually did put experts in the front row to explain the situation, and every measure that they did by saying that the experts called on the government to implement these measures. So on that level, you could see an exception to what happened in other countries. But what is similar to this populist pattern is, first of all, what happened on the lower levels. and the second is who is to blame for the pandemic. So unlike some countries where certain ethnic groups or immigrants were blamed for the spread of the virus, in Serbia, the government put the blame on Serbian citizens themselves. So first, it put the blame on Serbian citizens who came from abroad. The president literally said on several occasions that he's angry on himself because he allowed Serbian citizens to come back to the country because he had to, because the constitution forces him to do so. And it was a grave mistake, in his opinion. So, basically shifting the blame on why the numbers rise, well, is because of all of these people who are coming back. And, I tried to stop them, but, I had to allow them to come back. And the other, of course, is the blame on the citizens because they're not following the measures, that they are walking the parks, that they're walking their dogs, and how they are responsible for what's going to happen. And we even have a situation where SMS messages were sent to the citizens on their phones, warning them of Spanish and Italian scenarios and saying that there will be a disaster. So it was a clear attempt to somehow show the government as responsible and the citizens who are to blame why the measures are not working. But on the other hand, you could see that why we see an increase in numbers and where the new crisis emerged is usually when when corruption on the lower levels of governance actually allows the virus to spread. Like, for example, we shut down, we closed off all senior citizen centers at the beginning of the pandemic, and there was literally a ban from entering or leaving these buildings. And then massively, what happened is that the virus entered these institutions, and in one particular institution, every fourth death in Serbia because of the COVID-19 pandemic occurred in this one institution, in one city. So that tells you that the system wasn't really working, but still the blame was put on the citizens and not on the system. And of course, the government continued its political campaigning because, as I explained, we're going to have elections here as soon as the crisis is finished, or even maybe before the crisis is finished. So the government kept on campaigning. So not only that they were constantly present in all the media, well, because of the response to the pandemic, but they also personally traveled around Serbia, bringing medical equipment, explaining to citizens how to use them, to doctors how to use them. So there was clearly a political campaign going on. And at the same time, all the media who were close to the government continued their attacks on the opposition, blaming the opposition for why the citizens are irresponsible. The president literally said that if the citizens listen to the opposition, all the graveyards we have will not be enough. We'll have to build new graveyards to put all of us inside. So that much about the narrative used about how the entire system worked and how the emergency measures were even implemented. They were done so without the approval of the parliament. So basically, despite that there's a constitutional obligation that the parliament needs to basically proclaim the state of emergency, it was done before the parliament, without the parliament, based on the assumption that parliament cannot adjourn, and it did so only two days ago, so 1.5 months after the state of emergency was declared. And also we had examples here of journalists being arrested because of their reporting on the crisis and the response to the crisis. And all in all, this brought a lot of reactions from the European Union. And finally, what I forgot to mention is that the government also used this whole crisis to somehow make at least a rhetorical shift from the EU towards China, where the solidarity in the European Union was proclaimed to be dead, and China was proclaimed to be our only ally in the situation. And this was done. It was done at the very beginning of the crisis, and this narrative went on, and it goes on now for more than a month. And all this attracted a lot of attention. now to wrap it up, if I could explain what was the lessons, or let's say some patterns visible in Serbia, it is, first of all, the government tends to accumulate power in the executive more than it was the case before. Second is it shifts the blame elsewhere. So in the Serbian case, to the citizens of Serbia. In some other countries, we could see maybe in the migrants or foreigners. And the third thing is it uses the lack of attention by the EU to strengthen this anti-EU narrative and somehow absolve itself from blame coming from Brussels. And I think this is something which is visible in the EU member states as well, but I guess this is up to other speakers to maybe confirm or deny. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you to all the speakers for your very interesting contributions. I will now ask a few questions before we move on to the Q&A. I would like to ask Anna, you said in your research that you identified 48 countries in high risk, 34 at medium risk, and then 47 countries that managed to respond to the pandemic without jeopardizing democratic standards, basically. And so the question that then arises, I think, is how can we perhaps restart some of the democratic processes in those countries at high and medium risk? And if there is perhaps something that the international community can do, and maybe if you could just briefly mention what are the lessons learned from the countries that managed to respond to the crisis without jeopardizing the democratic standards?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thanks. First of all, we can clearly see that in those countries at medium or high risk, there is definitely a role for both the international community as well as for civil society activists, for the national population, for opposition parties to put pressure on governments, and in parts that also works. I mean, what I mentioned before, that was basically about Poland. There was the big debate about, I think, a month ago, when the initial plan was to introduce absentee voting only for elderly voters, so for those that are more safe bet for the ruling party. People protested against that nationally as well as internationally, and then that was changed and extended. That right was extended to the whole population. Still, there are challenges with regards to the Polish electoral process. So I don't want to praise the process, but still we can see in Poland as well as in several other countries that governments are still responsive to the national and international debate about the measures that they take. So I think, and this is definitely needed. And this was also one of the reasons why we did this index, because we don't call it a backsliding index, we call it a backsliding risk index. So we don't say necessarily that those countries have already declined in terms of their democracy, but they're administrating the state of emergency or the emergency situation in a way that is not good for democracy. And one of these ways, and I was really interested to hear Nicolas' very detailed report about Serbia, because Serbia is one of those countries that we have put at high risk, and now listening to everything you say, I think you basically would confirm this assessment. And one of these things is indeed the parliament. Yes, of course, during a pandemic like this one, physical interactions of people, but there are ways parliaments can meet while keeping distance, either in a larger plenary setting or when convening only a limited number of parliamentarians, or doing more remotely. So there are definitely ways Parliament can convene, and parliaments are relevant for making the system work. So this is really something that is sort of like structural way of ensuring that there is oversight, that criticism is voiced, and that measures are implemented that are actually better. And what you described now from Serbia is also something that we saw in India, for example. So first populist governments saying, oh, this is maybe like not more than a mere flu, right? And then overnight changing to a super draconic response that does not take into consideration the needs of many parts of the population. We've all seen these horrific reports of the migrant workers in India being forced to go back home in a very short time period. And one of the reasons why democracy actually helps to address a crisis like this is because democracy provides the very institutions where those kind of concerns should be at least represented, right? Where and by debating about how to address an emergency like this, and if it only is a 48-hour debate in a parliament, I mean, some of the countries that we marked green had super rapid processes with like laws being tabled in on Saturday and then they being voted on Tuesday or on Monday or something, right? But at least this time window for a debate allows also for these measures to be improved. Because I mean, that's one of the reasons why we favor democracy over dictatorship, because in a democracy, different points of views are voiced and help to come to a better solution that satisfies the interests of more groups of the population. So this is probably the main thing that can be learned from those low-risk countries, that there is a way of making the processes inclusive while responding swiftly to the crisis.
Thank you very much, Anna. We actually have a question from the audience about India, so maybe we will get to that later. Christian, as you mentioned, the crisis disclosed the populist nationalist tendencies in Hungary and Poland, but you also mentioned that even the Czech Republic and Slovakia are not the stark examples. So I'm kind of wondering maybe who's next, and do you think that we can expect maybe some form of domestic backlash against those governments in the V4 countries once perhaps the situation with the pandemic settles and for example the economic crisis kicks in? And how do you foresee the impact on the V4 countries' position within the EU and the already often difficult or strained relations?
All right, thank you very much for that interesting question. I think in terms of addressing the actual pandemic, the V4 countries have done quite well. The Czech Republic, especially in terms of numbers, even though they might be slightly lower than they are in reality due to different taxonomy for calculating casualties compared to, for instance, Belgium, the numbers are still good. So in terms of the pandemic response, I don't think that's such a viable avenue towards criticism of the V4. So from an immediate perspective, I don't think that the Czech Republic and Slovakia are in danger of embarking upon a Polish or Hungarian path, at least not because of COVID-19. It might happen for other reasons, because other developments might exacerbate the schism between the V4 and the rest of the EU. But I don't think COVID-19 will be the push, so to speak, that pushes the region as a whole down a worse path. I think what is probably more risky from an EU perspective in regards to the V4 is the push that right now is occurring to make the European Green Deal the center of economic recovery. So far only Slovakia has co-signed the letter that right now is signed by 17 European member states on making the Green Deal the fulcrum for economic recovery after the crisis. And the Czech Republic, particularly due to its reliance on fossil fuels and the power that ČEZ, the energy company here in the Czech Republic, has, that is more likely to meet resistance when the push becomes even stronger. And the same goes for Poland and Hungary, where much of the domestic political elite's power is tied to fossil industries and companies. And this push for a green economic recovery is probably what could accelerate or exacerbate the tendencies towards a multi-speed Europe. And should that happen, then these countries risk being left behind through their own choice. It's not like they're not being offered to get on the train, so to speak. But it might create further divisions that can then be extrapolated by these governments in order to fuel their Euroscepticism, because as Valina also mentioned, populists rarely let a crisis go to waste. It's often the cornerstone of generating domestic political support. But with COVID-19 and climate change, I would say it's a bit more abstract, simply due to the nature of these crises than foreigners, for instance. So it's harder to drum up the same level of support as the migration crisis enabled. And we also see that in many Western countries, such as Denmark, where at the height of the migration crisis, the Danish People's Party reached 21% of the popular vote. Yet in the last election, they only received 9%, and they have stagnated since. And that happened largely because the Social Democratic ruling party basically appropriated their anti-migration stance in order to close that flank down. And once that flank got closed, then basically the populists had no agenda. With climate, that is going to be harder. And in that case, I think maybe the tendency of fueling general Euroscepticism within the V4 will accelerate, but following a narrative instead that we're having a multi-speed Europe with an upper class of Western and Northern countries and a lower class of Southern and Eastern countries, which will then be used to justify the rampant Euroscepticism that permeate these countries. But I think in and of itself, COVID-19, at least in terms of pandemic response, is not a viable avenue. But later on, depending on the economic impact and depending on which shape the European economic recovery will take, it might very well turn into a viable crisis for populists to capitalize on.
Okay, thank you very much, Christian, for your input. Valina, I would like to ask you, Nicola briefly mentioned other external actors such as China, and given that you at the Institute focus on the security perspective, on the security implications for the whole region, I was wondering whether you could maybe discuss or briefly point out how are some of the external actors such as Russia or China maybe affecting the nationalism at home in the European countries, if there is perhaps some role in reinforcing such sentiments in the EU.
Yes, thank you, Nicola, for a very, very timely question. Now, China and Russia, these are two major powers that we are closely following as regards the global system transformation and as regards global affairs. And indeed, the dragon bear, as I call it, has been trying to capitalize on the COVID-19 crisis in following manner. Now, China, of course, is a very, very new actor for us and is right now being perceived actually as systemic rival on the side of European member states. We have first reports coming last year on the side of European Union institutions, basically describing China not only as a significant economic partner, but also as a potential competitor and systemic rival. And just today, we are publishing an ETNC network report on China's activities in various member states during the COVID-19 crisis outbreak. And these are 16, 17 member states' perspectives. What exactly happened on the side of China, I would not like to reveal much from this report because it's available for every one of you, so everyone can click on the ETNC network report. You can find it very easily on social media and internet, and basically it tries to wrap up what kind of actions, what kind of measures, what kind of, if you like, propaganda information was spread or was launched during the last 2 months. Maybe to wrap it up for you, it varies from country to country, so we cannot point to one singular approach when it comes to China. It differs in some of the countries where there is a stronger interest due to business relations, due to FDIs, due to longer engagement. Probably there are indeed more steps or more, it's a broader spectrum of measures. In other countries, for instance, specifically in the former Soviet space, so to say, Central Eastern European countries, we observe a kind of a copy-paste tactics we've seen from another actor, namely Russia, during previous crises where Russia was trying to capitalize politically, trying to instigate differences, trying to also popularize, if you like, particular populist slogans and so on and so forth. So yes, indeed, there are on both sides are specific actions that have been taken in the last 2 months to capitalize on the crisis. Russia is a very known actor for us. There are, meanwhile, also institutional approaches. You can find on the side of the European Union already institutional coverage being published when it comes to Russia. So all of this information is available. My expectation is that specifically this space will be growing. That means that the Dragon Bear will be looking for opportunities how to fill certain gaps, how to capitalize on crises as this one, and specifically in countries, and my colleagues mentioned some cases where the government probably didn't react very swiftly. Well, there was a backlash, so to say, political backlash. Then, of course, this creates opportunities for external actors to try to influence the society, to try to create certain attitudes. So old practices are being revived. They are being also adapted to new realities. I wouldn't say that the two countries are cooperating or coordinating measures and actions at this stage, but I wouldn't exclude the possibility for the future once certain global and regional power competitions start emerging and becoming very obvious to the political decision makers on the old continent, that there might be also certain coordination on the side of the Dragon Bear when it comes to campaigns, disinformation campaigns, and propaganda tools. So old playbook is being revived. It's also being copy-pasted to some extent, but it's also being readapted by China. And let's be honest about it. China has become a stronghold on Europe before Europe managed a so-called shift towards Asia. So basically, China is already here. And now, of course, the question is whether such kind of pandemic, and especially what comes afterwards, that means risk of a possible Great Depression. Even if we don't end up with a Great Depression, but we have a long-term recession lasting maybe for 1-2 years, this will have huge repercussions for our political systems, for our social and economic indicators, and this will create opportunities for major external players to step in, to fill vacuums, to close gaps, and to capitalize on political outcomes.
Thank you very much, Valina. So if you are interested in reading more about China, make sure to read this report that Valina just mentioned. Nicola, I was wondering, you mentioned, this is kind of related, you pointed out that the Serbian government is sort of glorifying China while deploying anti-EU rhetoric. And I am wondering, since Serbia is a candidate country for EU membership, how do you think that this current crisis can affect the long-term direction of Serbia in relation to the EU?
Well, I would say that even if China and Russia didn't exist, we would invent them. In the sense that the Serbian government needs China and Russia, and that most of pro-Russian and pro-Chinese propaganda in Serbia and the Western Balkans actually comes from the Serbian government. And this, I wouldn't even call it a shift. I would say flirting with China and Russia occurs for some years now. And it has been raising a lot of eyebrows in Brussels and EU member states, because as you mentioned, Serbia is negotiating for EU membership and is not only expected to become a member eventually, but also to gradually align its foreign policy with the one of the European Union. And this is not happening. Actually, the numbers are either stagnating or getting lower if we look at, for example, how much Serbia aligns with EU foreign policy declarations, how it votes in international bodies such as the UN General Assembly, etc., etc. So this kind of flirting with China and Russia is there. It is there for several reasons. One has to do with Kosovo, obviously. But what is more interesting is this message that goes to Brussels whenever Serbia is somehow, let's say, strengthening its ties with Russia and China. It is the message to Brussels and the EU member states that Serbia has some kind of alternative. And usually these kind of messages are sent when there is some kind of criticism from the European Union when it comes to state of democracy in Serbia and the general direction where Serbia is going, the lack of progress in negotiations. You could always see that that these kind of let's say activities when it comes to China and Russia are always there in these kind of situations. And right now, for example, so on the very first day, so before the pandemic actually started in earnest in Serbia, we saw a message where the President Vučić said that the solidarity in the EU is a fairy tale. It doesn't exist. And that China is the only possible ally of Serbia, and that we will establish a steel friendship between the two if China manages to help us. And this kind of narrative went on. We had Chinese doctors coming here with all the media pump. On the other hand, we had, of course, a lot of assistance from the EU, but it has been largely absent from mainstream media. The president almost never mentioned it. So this is the kind of a clear attempt to somehow sideline the EU. And a lot of it has to do with the fact that there was a lot of criticism from the EU in the past several months about the direction where Serbia is heading. And right now, there's a lot of criticism because of the way the state of emergency was introduced, how the parliament was sidelined, how journalists were arrested. And because of all of these, of course, issues, you see stronger and stronger reactions from the EU. And then, of course, this kind of anti-EU message also is there, let's say, deliberately, that, It's a message to Brussels not to be too strict because Serbia has other options. So, so when it comes to China and Russia, I repeat, it's a concern, but in my opinion, it is not that much of a matter of these countries influencing the Western Balkans as much as it is an issue of our own governments needing them, both for, of course, investments and for economic reasons, but also as some kind of alternative to the EU when, because, you know, the Chinese money doesn't come with commitments when it comes to, you know, corruption and respect for rule of law. When the EU gives you funds, it cares how you use them. When China gives you funds, it doesn't care how you use them. So of course, the Serbian government and some other governments in the region as well prefer to have this kind of economic assistance and prefer you know, this kind of support than the one that comes with conditions.
Thank you very much, Nicola. So we will now turn to the questions from the audience. Finally, there are quite a few. So we will answer only a few of them, and then I will make sure to forward the rest of them to the speakers if they would like to answer them later on. So the first question is from Baris Aksai, and it's to the whole panel. In your opinions, what will be the effect of COVID-19 on the future of multilateralism and global governance? We have been seeing a lot of unilateralism, rise of populist discourse. Even the EU has been experiencing serious backslide as a regional body. So which one of you would you like to reply? Just raise a hand or unmute. Okay, Christian, please. And then Valina, sorry.
Right, I just had to find the unmute button. Thanks. Well, I think in terms of multilateralism and global governance, the narrative supporting that is quite strong. For instance, you already had the EU on the 26th of January warning member states that COVID-19 represented a serious risk through the European Centre for Disease Control. And at the same time, the EU asked member states if they needed assistance with acquiring test kits, protective equipment, ICUs, and so on and so forth. And the member states basically said that they were perfectly adequately prepared for the crisis and they didn't need help from the EU already on the 26th of January. And I suspect that as the crisis escalates, we'll have more of such incidents where it becomes clearly apparent that multilateralism and international cooperation represents a lot of benefits compared to a nationalist and isolationist stance for countries. I think the current rise of nationalist discourse we have is, of course, worrying in many cases, but as Anna also mentioned initially in her presentation, in many of the risk countries or countries with problems, these tendencies were already there and they were already being exacerbated long before COVID-19. So inherently, there is nothing much surprising about these countries and their governments doubling down on their path towards populism or nationalism or corruption. I take solace in the fact that many other countries are utilizing the EU and other similar bodies to make a strong case for multilateralism and making a strong case for the EU realigning itself and being more prepared, not just for future pandemics, but also for climate change and strengthening cooperation in these areas, such as by taking home production of essential medical equipment or other equipment to the EU that for a long time has been outsourced to cheaper countries. So I think in many ways, this crisis could be the impetus to realign our multilateralism alongst a more sustainable line of managing globalization rather than always pursuing the lowest possible costs. So I would like to be optimistic that the sentiments we're seeing from some countries just follow their existing fault lines and doesn't represent necessarily novel challenges to democracy.
Thank you. Valina, please. Would you like to?
Yes, I would just add several thoughts on the matter, as Christian actually wrapped it up in a perfect manner. I myself am looking at multilateralism as part of this old global system that is right now being in transition. We don't know yet how exactly this transition will take place. There is indeed the expectation on the one side that the pandemic, the global pandemic, might unleash certain forces in favor of strengthening multilateral formats and structures. That means international organizations, forums that create synergies between the leading countries. However, as I'm someone dealing with global trends and scenario monitoring, I think that we are going to witness a situation where probably only a few relevant global and regional players will be more or less in favor of multilateralism. Of course, the European Union is a collective actor, and the member states will be in favor of multilateralism, as it is in our interest to have strong institutions, also international institutions, because a supra organization as the European Union thrives on solid fundaments of international organizations and institutions. I don't see it happening. I think that the trend of seeing United States, withdrawing from relevant international organizations will continue. We will see also China trying to create its alternatives, and it's already happening. I mean, even if we take the example of China as being active right now in certain institutions, and they don't want to start the debate with the World Health Organization, because then we will need another webinar for it. But what I see is that China, of course, will try to somehow shape this multilateralism to its favor. So I don't see that specifically countries, the democratic countries, will follow. At some point, there will be the question of probably two systems multilateralism, where authoritarian rule of governance countries will basically try to create their own way of, of institutionalizing international relations with their partners and with that with their allies and close countries. And that, of course, can be seen as a positive trend. But this is not going to be the multilateralism the way we understand it. So yes, on the one side, more regionalization, more multilateralism, a new mode of multilateralism, but then on the other side, the US-led global order with all of its structures, the way we know it, is going to slowly but steadily disappear. That's my trend scenario for the next years, and of course, is going to be accelerated by the global pandemic.
Thank you very much, Valina. And another question is from Riccardo Mazzucchelli. It is a very long question, so I will just pick a part. Basically, he's referring here to it is directed to Anna and Christian. And he is asking about the freedom of speech. And if international organizations are really equipped to ensure that the countries don't cross the line related to the freedom of speech, but also it can relate to other freedoms. When considering that the organizations are actually reliant on the country's funds often.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean that is an ongoing challenge in international relations, that we all ask for more multilateralism. We always ask, for example, also for better United Nations, but then in the end, the way global governance works these days, the UN cannot do much without its member states, and neither can the EU. So often also when we blame things on the EU, I think Christian has very nicely put that point out here also, that the EU was offering help, but their member states didn't take them. So it's always, there's always a give and take between member states and international organizations. Nevertheless, international organizations have an important normative power. And for example, Michelle Bachelet, the UN Human Rights Commissioner, has just made a statement where she clearly said that where she clearly condemned limitations to freedom of expression due to the COVID-19 crisis. And I think such responses are clearly important. The EU has a bit more instruments here at hand than the UN bodies, perhaps, and I clearly expect the EU to do more here when it comes to their own member states abusing the current emergency situation to undermine democracy.
Okay, thank you, Anna. Another question is from Axel Miller, which is directed to Nicola. It's related to the whole Western Balkan region, and Axel is interested if you could briefly elaborate a little further on the situation in the whole region, and whether there is perhaps a common pattern that could be detected for the Western Balkans as a region in relation to their response to the crisis and the nationalist and populist tendencies.
I will try to be as brief as possible. So I don't think there are any clear regional patterns applicable for every country. Maybe the only pattern is that the problems you had before the pandemic, you have them now maybe more accentuated and more visible. Like, for example, I explained the situation in Serbia. Now it's becoming clear that our democracy is shaken to the bone, and in Kosovo the political crisis was there already before the pandemic. The government was shaky, before all of this. And what happened in Kosovo, for those who don't know, the junior partner in the coalition actually initiated the motion of no confidence. So basically the government collapsed from within for some reasons which barely have anything to do with the pandemic. They have much more to do with the dialogue with Serbia, etc. Now, of course, in all countries, there is maybe this pattern that the executive becoming more important than it was. The ruling parties and the governments get even more media attention than they had previously. But I think this is a pattern visible basically everywhere at the moment, at the time of the pandemic. So this is not something specifically Western Balkan. And I would have even expected there to be more dramatic consequences in the entire region than actually happened, because except Serbia and Kosovo, in other countries, nothing that dramatic occurred. So no major political crisis, no crisis of the government where the government fell and things like that. Now, of course, you have some problems in every country about personal data protection. Maybe this is something that could be said, that this is some kind of a pattern in some of the countries where data related to the patients became public. In Montenegro, there was a big scandal about this. And of course, one of the things that could be said to be a pattern is that corruption throughout the Western Balkan countries is now maybe even more visible, because now you can see very directly the consequences of putting incompetent people in important positions I'm not talking about the government. I'm not talking about the lower levels of government. I'm talking about hospitals, about senior citizen centers, and you could see how the system doesn't really work. But besides that, I would not say that there are these general dramatic patterns outside of what we see, let's say, in majority of European countries.
Thank you very much, Nicola. I think we can briefly do one last question, and then I will ask each speaker to conclude with a 1 minute final statement before we leave the discussion. There is a question from Jason Schneck. My question is, will the lockdown measures give more legitimacy to populist ideas after the pandemic, specifically the closing borders and restricting migration and focusing programs only on their citizens, especially with the potential economic depression in the aftermath? This question is directed to the entire panel, so whichever one of you would like to briefly respond to that. Anna, okay, please.
Yeah, just very briefly. So, I mean, populists those populists that we see in Europe build on three ideas, right? The one idea is that they are the representatives of the people. The second idea is that elites are bad and experts are bad. And the third thing that we see in Europe with the far-right populism is indeed the nationalism and the anti-immigration stance. So, and I think like several on the panel have already said that the second point with experts and professionals being bad, that is something that is really challenged in this crisis. People see now that you actually need competent people to run the country in order to protect you from the harmful effects of a virus like this one. So I think here populists will also continue to be under attack. On the third point, with the nationalism and the anti-immigration sentiment, indeed, I'm similar to what Christian said earlier. I'm also afraid that with the economic crisis that is going to come, typically such nationalist sentiments find fertile ground. So I'm afraid that we might see a rise here.
Okay, thank you very much, Anna. So now I would like to wrap up the session, and I will just ask each one of you to close the session with a 1 minute short statement. So Valina, please, would you like to start?
Yes, my statement is clear. Nationalism, populism are cyclical processes. They will not disappear. So it is up to the political decision makers, up to the governments to launch transparent, bold, and citizens closed, right? Citizens close measures and actions, not only now during the COVID-19 crisis, but also afterwards. And that means what also a previous colleague said, if we slide into Great Depression, if we slide into a long-term recession with big unemployment rates, this might endanger some of the European countries because the governments will not have the necessary means and the necessary capabilities to respond adequately, even if they wish. So we should be prepared for some sort of strengthening of populism. But then again, on the side of population, and that's my last sentence, there is a strong support for European Union institutions. According to the last polls, according to the last European parliamentary votes, there is a clear sign that the citizens are in favor of strong European Union institutions next to transparent and bold and democratic governmental institutions in the European states.
Thank you. Nicola, please.
Yes, well, I would say that I am actually quite concerned about what is going to happen to democracy, not only in the Western Balkans, but also throughout the world. As I fear that this crisis, combined with the populist tendencies we could already see, it makes a perfect storm. That maybe this is exactly what populists needed to maybe step forward with some of the policies they maybe wanted to implement before, but they could not do so because when talking about EU member states and EU candidate countries, that there was a tension to what's happening here, that there were some limits to how far you can go with this crisis and everything it entails, including the economic consequences. This kind of a tension is going to definitely be lower than it was, and there could be some major consequences. Now, of course, things do not necessarily have to be that negative. I think this is a struggle which is ahead of us, how to prevent these consequences from being that negative. But I am pretty concerned with what lies ahead.
Thank you very much. Anna?
Sorry, just a second. I answered some of the questions directed to me in the questions and answers because I knew that there would be no time. So that's it.
Okay, no problem. Thank you. I will make sure to, as I said, to direct the unanswered questions then to the speakers for if they would like to answer them later. So Ada, please, may I ask you for your final short statement?
Well, I'm fundamentally an optimist, so I like to see the glass half full, and I'm very happy to see that indeed a lot of countries are showcasing how to address this pandemic also effectively while maintaining democratic standards. I hope that during the next months, other countries will follow this example. And in order for this to happen, we really need the pressure from international organizations. We need the pressure from citizens, from civil society, to make sure that those wannabe autocrats don't seize the opportunity of the crisis of dismantling democracy.
Thank you very much for keeping it very brief. And last, please, Christian.
Thank you very much. First of all, thanks to everyone who tuned in to listen, and I'll do my best to also get back to the questions that were left unanswered in the coming days. As the other speakers mentioned, I think there are both grounds for worry, but also for optimism. But I think if we are to stay on the optimistic side, this crisis also represents an opportunity to maybe not rethink our existence, but at least rethink our view on the future and the existence we actually hand over to our kids and grandkids one day. Because when we are facing a pandemic like this, it brings into question not only the immediate challenge, but also how do we, for instance, understand security? Is it really commensurate with the challenges of tomorrow that we, for instance, invest heavily into new fighter jets? Or would it be better if we funneled additional money into education so that we would improve the media literacy of our population and inoculate them better against disinformation? Would it be better if we invested more heavily in green solutions so that we actually leave a sustainable planet for those who comes after us, rather than pursue a short-term economic recovery, which will incur a much greater cost further down the road for our descendants? I think the crisis, more than anything, in my relatively short lifetime at least, highlights the opportunity for these discussions and to rearrange our society along more sustainable lines, because the crisis really shows both the limits of nationalism and populism and the dangers associated with it, as we see from many countries who face thousands more deaths than they would have to if they responded with science and rationality. but it also highlights the opportunities ahead of us, especially given, for instance, financial megatrends, where right now 4 out of 5 coal power plants in Europe only run at a deficit, and they need heavy subsidization. Even globally, fossil fuels are subsidized 3 times as much as renewables, even though renewables by now, by and large, are more economically sustainable and certainly more climate sustainable. So if I were to wrap it up, I think a crisis usually empowers people, not necessarily everyone, but it usually gives birth to new movements or new thoughts and new ideas. And I think it's important that everyone, and it's also why I'm so happy so many tuned in to listen, try and think a bit outside the box and empower themselves on, well, how does this actually allow us to rearrange our society, to think about our society in a new way rather than the same old, which was already before the crisis heading down a path that I think fundamentally would be unsustainable, but which the crisis definitely shows is not the right way. And there are many areas where we can rethink our existence in this light, but I do think that discussion is fundamentally important because the crisis represents an unrivaled opportunity to actually facilitate real change.
Thank you very much, Christian. Perfect. I would, on this positive note, we can wrap up this session. I would like to thank to all the panelists for joining us and for the fruitful discussion and providing us with, I think, a lot of food for thought. And also thanks again to our partner Europeum for co-organizing today's event. And of course to you, to the audience, for taking the time to be with us and also engaging in the Q&A. Also, I just want to mention that the recording of today's event will be then available on our, as the EGIC's and the Europeans' social media. And also we will be publishing a report with a summary, the main points raised by today's speakers in here. So stay tuned for that. And also next week we will have our second webinar, which will be focusing, this time we will move on to back to the Middle East, and we will be focusing on ISIS and in the time of coronavirus. So if you would be interested in that topic, make sure to follow us on the social media and follow the updates in there. So thank you very much again to all the speakers and to you, the audience, and have a nice rest of the day.